Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's been a while, took a long hiatus, wasn't supposed to be this long. It was postponed for, well, it was delayed by a week or extended by a week because of course, the update I put out about the ice storm and everything like that, and my voice, which is actually still on its way back, but it's sufficient now, more than enough to record some videos. I hope that you guys had a good Christmas. I hope that this new year is great for you. It is my goal to make it better for you and contribute to it being better for you by making better content and still maintaining the regularity and consistency of my content uploads. We have a new guest on the channel. This is Nellie. This was my girlfriend's Christmas gift. So it's technically, I mean, you could say it's my cat because I paid for her, but it's her cat. But she'll feature in the videos here and there, probably. So say hello. This video, this introductory welcoming back video, is a critique video. It is on Jay Feldman, who features on Ben Greenfield's channel. Ben Greenfield Life is his channel name. It's called The Surprising Truth on Cold Exposure, Carbs, and Keto versus Carnivore. So anyone that's familiar with Jay Feldman's rhetoric knows that he really doesn't quite grasp the concepts of physiology in general. He doesn't understand when his arguments fall and are based upon, rather, is probably the best way of putting it, a begging the question fallacy. All I deal with on this channel is a bunch of question begging. It's ridiculous. It needs to stop. People need to be aware of when they're making such arguments, and they're frankly not. And so we're going to go ahead and correct those errors here. I have not watched this video. I was recommended this video by Coach Stephen Thomas a long time ago, actually. It took me forever to get to this video, but I get to the videos that I am recommended, at least at the moment. If I grow my channel more than it is right now, well, that's not going to be the case. And it seems to be growing, and it seems like that's going to be an issue. So at the moment, I could take advantage of the fact that, yes, I do have the ability to still get to recommended videos. Sometimes I still miss one or two, though. So already having issues. But anyway, before we get into this video, I want to say a few more things. Feel free to skip ahead if you'd like to the reaction. I will put the timestamp on when it starts up in the top right corner of the screen, probably. But I think that this is some stuff that you may want to hear. First of all, thank you guys for the support. And I don't just mean the moral support. I mean the support that you guys have granted me, even if it's just by your viewership or your ostensibly low contributions through Patreon. I'm talking about monetary support. I did not foresee this happening where I could actually make this a job, a full-time job that allows me to put food on my table. I sort of saw that in my dream-like utopia. In terms of its practicality, in terms of its plausibility, I did not think that it was going to take place so soon, at least. And it's all thanks to you guys for contributing, even, once again, just views to the channel, comments, helping my videos permeate in the algorithm. I thoroughly appreciate it. If you don't think that your contributions are actually serving as a significant contribution, if you think they are insignificant, you are very mistaken. But I haven't exactly said that before publicly, so in order for you guys to know that they really are helping me, I'm going to directly say that to you right now. They are absolutely helping, and I do believe that if things continue to grow the way that they are growing, and they have been growing, that I will be able to thank all of you for me being able to move to Florida to start up my treatment process again, and to start contributing towards my full recovery from my condition. Many of you already know what my condition is if you've seen my interviews with people, and or if you've seen my channel trailer that's on my homepage on my channel. So of course, once again, I'm not fully fixed, but I'm functional, but I still have a long ways to go, and I still deal with pain. So yes, that is the first thing I want to get out of the way. The second thing I want to get out of the way is something that I mentioned before I went on my hiatus. The course that Coach Peter, Carnivore Coach Peter, and I, and Dr. Abs, and Bart K actually have been contributing towards and working on is still available. However, it is no longer 50% off, which makes sense if you had watched my last video that I did in December last month. However, it is still 50% off for Patreon members. So if you are a Patreon member and you'd like to sign up for the course and you haven't already, if you message Peter and you tell him how you were referred there, then he will know to give you a 50% discount on the course. It is a, once again, coaching certification course. You will get certified for your work through the course. You will be certified as a coach afterwards, legally. We will be having a special Q&A for Patreon members for that very soon. That is not scheduled yet, but it will be this month. Peter and I have already talked about that. So if you are not already subscribed to my Patreon, you might want to do that now. Next thing, the second edition of my book is almost out. The audiobook is fully recorded. It's fully edited on my end. and it is with my audio editor right now, and very soon it will be submitted for approval, and then once it is finished, then all of the other copies can be released as well, because the physical copies are already done, the ebook is already done, and then the only other platform and format rather is the audiobook. And so once the audiobook is done, everything else will be released. We are aiming for, at the very latest, April 1st for that book to be out, just like it was released last year. It was released on March 31st last year. So just a little update on the book. This time there actually will be an audiobook, and there will be a functional ebook that will not be removed by Amazon for formatting issues, which were not my fault anyway. And finally, expect more content from me soon in terms of its variety, in terms of maybe a little bit of an increase in frequency. It takes a long time for me to get videos out, as you guys already know, because I do all of the editing myself, and if you pay attention to the length of my videos, yeah, they're already long, and that's after I do cuts. With all the cuts that I make, I cut out about 30 minutes worth of content, and it's all breaths, so it's not really content. It's breaths. It's very slight slip-ups that you've actually seen before in some of my videos that I've left pretty much uncut. I've done those before just to prove that I'm not cutting out a bunch of silly errors that I shouldn't be making if I actually knew what I was talking about, sort of thing. So anyway, I'm working on a lot more types of content with other people, and so hopefully those types of videos start getting released very, very soon. And I hope you guys enjoy them as well. So with all of that being said, as per usual, please, if you haven't subscribed to the Patreon, go ahead and do that to gain access to 1 week early uploads, ad-free content, uncensored content, 1 extra video per week, and also my new Discord server that I've released for exclusive Patreon members. And also, if you haven't bought my book, the first edition of Contraindicated, I would recommend doing that as well. First edition is almost off the shelves, the online shelves, so if you want your exclusive copy, get it now. And with that being said, now let's jump directly into this video and correct what is going to be unequivocally wrong, knowing who Jay Feldman is.
In a long-term low-carb diet, we still have...
Okay, define that. Already an issue. I get that you're being a little informal, perhaps, because it's a casual interview, but it is important to find long-term, because a long-term ketogenic diet for a standard American is oftentimes 3 days, because they actually start to experience adverse symptoms if they transition improperly and abruptly. So define long-term, please.
Levels of these stress hormones?
Nope. Already a problem. See, we actually covered this already on Bart's channel in a live stream.
Leads to increased stress hormones. That is cortisol, epinephrine.
All right. So the very idea that there is such a thing as a stressful hormone is fallacious. It is completely wrong. There's no such thing as a stressful hormone. There are hormones that are associated with presentations of distress in the body. Those are things like cortisol. Those are things like epinephrine. Remember that? There is no such thing as a stress hormone, okay? Because stress implies it itself being stressful, which implies further that it's distressing to the physiological system that it is involved in, okay? There are hormones that are associated with distress, invariably associated with distress. You're really referring to cortisol. Paul Saladino will now have you believe that glucagon is a distressing hormone because he's a moron. Man, I hope you missed this content. Anyway, there is no such thing as a stress hormone. Cortisol, for example, which is what he's implying right now, he is tacitly referring to, is a hormone that is involved in the gluconeogenic process, specifically the production of the 3 primary enzymes within the gluconeogenic pathway, those being PepCK, phosphoenolpyruvate carboxykinase, pyruvate carboxylase, I believe, as well as fructose 1,6-bisphosphatase, Jay Feldman, okay? So if you are not consuming a diet that is rich in carbohydrates, and your body therefore has to create the glucose endogenously more than it otherwise had to when you were consuming a bunch of carbs, what do you think is going to happen, at least acutely, because that's the other caveat, a lot of times this is an acute increase, again, define long-term, what do you think is going to happen to your cortisol? Perhaps, because sometimes it doesn't happen, actually. You think it's going to go up until the production of those enzymes attains the level that the body deems indicated to perform its processes, and then it will go back down again? Do you think that's what would happen? So, off to a great start. We're 4 seconds into this video.
Mostly in the form of glucagon, and then with cortisol.
Glucagon is a distressing hormone, guys. So let me get this straight. The primary catabolic hormone, catabolism being the primary predominating metabolic activity that we've existed in for, well, all of our existence as a species, and the proto-species, the proto-humans that preceded us, is a distressing hormone. That makes sense. You know, even in a society that eats predominantly carbohydrates, you still create glucose endogenously after a glucose bolus. Can you believe that? A lot of people don't know that. Metformin, I'm not going to get into the specifics. I know the specifics, but the way in which it works, the effects of it, is that it increases and enhances glucose uptake, sure, from the bloodstream, but it also inhibits the liver from creating as much glucose, which implies that even in a diabetic, hyperglycemic state, your body, your liver still produces glucose. Is that a sign, perhaps, that you should let the liver create all all of the glucose it requires, because what that tells you is that no matter how high your insulin is, it will not completely shut down gluconeogenesis. And the reason for that is clear. It's because our bodies are not designed to have exogenous glucose boluses introduced into it in massive quantities at a very high frequency of 3 times a day on average, usually more than that though. I grew up in a generation that has a lot more than that. I was one of those people. So, I mean, give me a break. Seriously?
The levels aren't elevated at baseline, but in terms of a response.
Define elevated as well. Relative term. And for how long?
But in terms of a response to stress or response to exercise.
Define stress. Me. Without stress, you die. What kind of responses are we talking about? You said exercise, for example. Great. Okay. So in response to exercise, you see an increase in glucagon. Do you know what glucagon is involved in, Jay? A process called glycogenolysis at the level of the liver, not at the level of the muscle, because muscle cells don't have glucagon receptors. But the liver does. And what process is upregulated during exercise in order to supply fuel for muscle contractions? Glycogenolysis? Jay, you're being ridiculous. You're being ignorant.
Let's say there's a greater increase in cortisol on a low carb diet versus a
Covered that.
or high carb diet. Long term, these hormones act as a signal.
Also, you just said high carb diet. Does that also mean high fat diet? Because that will also affect the markers in the studies that you're referring to, which please cite the studies on screen. Jay Feldman.
These hormones act as a signal for our bodies to turn down their metabolic rate because
Nonsense. If you are referring to those hormones in isolation, they can be associated with a lowering of the metabolic rate in situations like starvation. Sure. Do you know what also is highly associated with ketogenic diets, though, that are absent of carbohydrates, really any to speak of? An increase in metabolic activity, an increase in the calories released from the body. Jay, did you know that? And the reason for that is because of uncoupled mitochondria. Uncoupling proteins are activated in the absence of insulin and in increased circulations of serum glucagon. Jay, what the hell are you talking about? People that have truly distressing conditions that are associated with high chronic levels of cortisol are not exhibiting those levels due to a ketogenic diet, Jay. I'm sorry. It's due to anorexia, bulimia, usually, oftentimes, or a chronic inflammatory condition, which is always due to external factors because we're not designed to be chronically and systemically inflamed, okay? So come on, Jay, you're already failing. You're already hitting the floor with your face.
recognize that this is not sustainable.
Yes, it is. Okay. What isn't sustainable is, a low metabolic rate, implying too low to subserve your functions and indicated functions as a human being. Sure. But begging the question fallacy. Interesting. It's almost like I called it in the beginning that we were going to deal with that. That begs the question as to whether or not that is necessarily going to be exhibited and presented with in someone that consumes a ketogenic carnivorous diet, which it isn't if it's properly tenured and properly fortified and appropriately and prudently transitioned to. Jay Feldman.
Do continue to pull these resources from our stores. That's what the stress hormones do. And we're producing.
So covered the stress hormones. Also, are you implying that accessing fat stores in your adipocytes and perhaps your liver and your muscles is a bad thing? Because it's not. If anything, that's what a lot of people that have weight on them in the form of fat and water that they deem to be in excess are attempting to lose, Jay. That is a sign of being in a chronically inflamed and anabolic state, metabolically. Something that we are not designed to be in. Both of those things. And I covered that, didn't I, Jay? This is stupid, okay? So no, sorry, Jay, losing fat is not a bad thing, okay? And I know that you didn't explicitly say that, and you probably didn't imply it here, but that's what it sounds like coming out of your mouth. So we need to get our words right. We need to get our phraseology right. Is that a word? Well.
Oxidative stress in the process. Even though the engine.
Okay, so that's just a bunch of gobbledygook nonsense. Okay, if anything, ketones themselves, ketone bodies, have been associated with lower circulating reactive oxidation species production. Now, people say that that's necessarily the case. Ketones produce less ROS. I haven't seen any evidence to support that claim whatsoever. Okay, that is a theory, and perhaps it's true, but there is no evidence of that being the case whatsoever, that they are directly anti-inflammatory because of that mechanism. I suspect it probably has to do with the absance of exogenous glucose intake, but anyway.
Even though the engine isn't working as well, the fuel isn't optimal.
Nonsense. The engine isn't working as well, the fuel isn't optimal. These are your opinions, Jay. Okay? Did the body say that to you? Have your genes said that to you? It's not working as well. What's your evidence for that, Jay? What the hell are you talking about?
Forcing it anyway. And this has effects.
But we're forcing it anyway. Yeah. See, that was genuine laughter that came from my face. That is so silly.
The larger umbrella of our hormonal state, namely at our thyroid, we see reduction.
Okay, you can have thyroid hormone levels that seem to be ostensibly contraindicated, inappropriate for your physiology in order to subserve your indicated functions as a human being at any given instance in time, because you have a lack of a insulin response, or of an insulin response, a sufficient one, in order to synthesize, I don't know, thyroid hormones for metabolic function, Jay. Okay, so all of these things go right back to consuming insufficient protein for your needs. Okay? I wrote a paper on why gluconeogenesis is not demand-driven, and neither is any process in the body, because that is a chemical fallacy. You cannot have a process in the body be demand-driven necessarily. That's not how chemistry works. If you want to see that paper, right after this, I'm going to upload that paper to Patreon so that you guys can read it. But anyway, yes, I spent a lot of time thinking through that. Gluconeogenesis can be supply-driven. In fact, every single process can, according to Le Chatelier's principle.
Namely at our thyroid, we see reduction in things like testosterone.
Okay, so begging the question fallacy again, because that begs the question as to whether any reduction in testosterone is proportionally deleterious or proportionally indicative of deleterious health outcomes in the human body and presentations. Sean Baker has a recurring total and free testosterone that is incredibly low. Pretty sure his total testosterone level is in the hundreds in terms of nanograms per deciliter, not even peaking 200 nanograms per deciliter. And the man is massive. Okay, so clearly not in every single situation is it not indicated. Whatever your testosterone levels are in the body are exactly what they should be given the circumstances. Jay Feldman. Okay, if you want to say that the circumstances in which the body is placed is bad in terms of the external dietary environment, so the low carb ketogenic diet, that is your opinion, and you can work with that, which we've been working with it this entire time. But you cannot sit here and responsibly say things like, well, you see reductions in testosterone, which is bad. You can't do that, Jay, because they're patently not, because that's not how these things work. Okay, your genes have evolved under positive and negative selection pressures for billions of years. Okay, they have experience. They know what the they're doing. Okay,
And in the female reproductive hormones as well.
all right, so same argument there. Okay, so great, we're 49 seconds into this, and we've already eviscerated his entire basis for any further arguments. But we're going to talk about cold exposure apparently too. Okay, great.
All right, folks, I have a podcast guest today who has some very interesting theories,
Interesting is one way of putting it, Ben.
controversial on things like hormesis and carbohydrates. And
Let's see if he even understands hormesis in the first place, or carbohydrates, actually, and how they interact with our physiology. Because someone here actually knows biochemistry and muscle energetics, okay? Basic chemical phenomena, actually, of our bodies. And the other doesn't understand it at all, Jay Feldman. I have no idea about Ben's knowledge. He might not have any. He might just be someone that interviews these people to try and derive information from them. That's fine, but...
energy, and I think he probably kind of has an opinion on a lot of these things that differs from what you hear in mainstream health and biohacking. His name is Jay Feldman.
Okay, actually, it differs far less and is less contrarian and antithetical to the mainstream. Okay, he says fat bad, glucose good, effectively. He basically says eat a balanced diet, just make sure that it's full of whole foods. Whole foods, whatever the that means.
He's a health coach. He's an independent health researcher.
He's a health coach. Great. So this is another reason why you all should go ahead and sign up to be a coach, a carnivore coach that actually has integrity and veracity through our program, because this guy is a health coach. We need more health coaches that actually know what the they're talking about. So please go ahead and do that, because I have 4 modules, 4 lessons in that entire thing. Dr. Abs is going to have some soon. Bart K is going to have some. And Peter is also an amazing coach, the best that I've ever seen. And I do not lie in order to get sales on anything. I never do that. Most of the online coaching demographic is a bunch of burly, callous guys insulting people with offensive language. And it's offensive because it's so ignorant. They're so confident while being so ignorant. That's what makes it offensive. Peter is the exact opposite of that type of person. So anyway, Coach Feldman.
Host of a podcast called the Energy Balance Podcast. He has degrees in neuroscience and exercise physiology from the...
So he has a degree in exercise physiology. Okay, so that's fantastic. So he must understand necessarily muscle energetics then. Yeah, let's see if he actually understands any of it.
University of Miami. And kind of like me, he was originally going to go to medical school, but decided to forego that after realizing the conventional medical approach might not be the best solution to the health problems that many of us face. And
It's not, so he's right on that, okay? But if that's the case, then why are we appealing to his authority when it comes to his degrees that he has? I understand exercise physiology and muscle energetics more than most people that are exercise physiologists. I've actually made that patently and abundantly clear on this channel when I talk about muscle energetics, which is actually quite rare, but
now he's helping people with his podcast and
debatable.
Through different types of coaching and research that he does. And
does he do research? Does he actually do research? Because research is what you do in labs. And just because you do stuff in labs doesn't mean that you do it right. Most people in labs are trained monkeys just following directions. Does he do his own research? And if he does he do it responsibly?
He uses what is called the bioenergetic approach.
What does that mean?
Energetic approach. So I'm going to let Jay explain all of that to you as we jump in here. So Jay, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me on again, Ben.
Yeah. I forget, how many years ago was it that we got on and talked a little bit about bioenergetics?
Yeah, it must have been 2 years ago or so.
Yeah. And a lot has happened since then. Obviously, I think the carnivore diet has probably blown up since the last time that we talked, because we didn't
Thankfully, it's becoming more mainstream, but we are still a niche group.
really get a chance to dive too much into that. I know it's probably something that's come across your radar, I would imagine, even though you're living under a rock down there in Ecuador. And I've also just been thinking a lot about some of the things that you talk about when it comes to hormesis and energy. And I think a good jumping off point here would be for you to describe what the bioenergetic model actually is, which I realize could be like a 1 hour response, but I might interrupt you here and there.
Yeah, well, and I think it's a great starting place to kind of provide a contrast between this and most other views out there. So, and I've been there. You know, we're talking carnivore. I've done low carb, I've done keto, I've done intermittent fasting, and throughout my time doing that, didn't see the results I was expecting, and was always continuing to research, and came across what's called
research, or study and review other people's research.
Bioenergetic view of health, which is the idea that the energy that we produce inside of every cell, inside of the mitochondria, we normally consider that to be ATP.
It's not. That's an energy storage form, so to speak, because really in reality there's no energy stored between bonds and molecules. It basically is spontaneously created when they're broken apart, and it was taken from the field, so to speak. But yes, your mitochondria are the only organelles in the body, the only part of the body that actually creates energy in the form of chemical potential energy. Yes. Okay, what about it?
That drives our health. And when we
well, that's a very broad statement. That drives our health. I mean, it drives our survival because we require ATP for all of our biological processes, sure. But just because you're creating ATP doesn't necessarily mean you're healthy, right, Jay? It's a little vague.
Degenerative states, chronic health conditions, symptoms, anything from insomnia to fatigue to fatty liver disease, and on from there, autoimmune issues, the whole spectrum. What happens is there's a breakdown in energy production, and we're left.
Well, there's an association of that, yes.
Basically a lack of energy, a lack of ATP that causes degeneration and prevents us from effectively repairing every cell and tissue in our body.
Well, that can be a subsequent effect, yes. But your body's not just going to magically stop producing ATP at the rate at which is indicated, okay?
And also prevents us from feeling our best. And so that's the approach with which I view health. And
okay, so it's a vague approach, it's broad, and I don't know if it's because he's simplifying it for the sake of the conversation and for the sake of brevity, or if that's actually how vague his philosophy is. Being broad with your overall philosophy in order to make it as simplistic as possible while maintaining the integrity of it and the sophistication of it is totally fine, and it's not only fine, it's appropriate to do for ease of understanding and everything. But if you sacrifice the integrity of it, or if it's too broad to the point where it doesn't really make a lot of sense and it needs more clarification, well, then you're doing a disservice to yourself if you're abiding by that vague philosophy, and or other people if you are espousing that philosophy pontifically.
Digging into the whole spectrum of health issues, from neurodegenerative conditions to, as I said, fatty liver disease, autoimmune conditions, hormonal imbalances, you see basically breakdowns in mitochondrial respiration, breakdowns in energy production.
Right, so association. Yeah, great. So association doesn't necessarily equal causation, but we do know on a chemical basis that when you are inflamed, which is due to an external factor, basically invariably, because your body doesn't just naturally become inflamed for no reason, that it is associated with a decrease in redox potential as a result of a decrease in ATP production because of the associated commensurate increase in PI, inorganic phosphate, and that lowers the oxidative potential of cells, and that's highly associated with disease. But could it possibly be the thing causing the inflammation that's causing the disease? Again, association does not equal causation, no matter how strong the association is. Okay, I've also covered that on this channel last year. Can't believe I'm saying last year.
So my focus is on how we fix that and how we maximize the cellular energy production so that we can maximize our health.
Well, another begging the question fallacy, because why should you necessarily at all times strive towards maximizing ATP production? Okay, there's a limit. If you're talking about restoring it to what your body otherwise would create if it weren't systemically inflamed, well, then we share the same goal, but that's not what you said.
Okay, so let's jump into some illustrative examples here. Let's take this idea, and I think this would be a good way for you to explain how you view this whole idea of energy. Let's take something like hormesis, right? The whole, like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger concept.
Right, exactly. So that's not hormesis. Lectins won't kill you upon consumption, but is it hormetic to eat them? No, it's not. Hormesis, an example of hormesis would be resistance training. You induce inflammation because you induce injury into the tissues, the muscle tissues, which eventually after they heal will become bigger if you applied the correct and appropriate stimulus for it, which will help you contend with the world around you better than if you otherwise did not have that same amount of muscle tissue on you, or the same size of muscle. Okay, that's hormetic because you actually do reap a benefit afterwards. Okay, you are less likely to be injured during a fall if you have more muscle around the area that is experiencing the brunt of the fall, as compared to someone that would experience the fall in the exact same location, the exact same force that is your genotypically identical twin. Anyway.
A lot of people, especially in the longevity sector, are pursuing these days, right? Like exposing yourself to mild amounts of oxidative stress, fasting.
So say mild amounts of oxidative stress. So all types of oxidative stress, all types of activities that promote ROS production, that's hormetic necessarily? No, it's not. So that's the myth. I knew it. I knew that this was going to happen. I said this in the very beginning of the video. Do these people know what hormesis is? Now, as much as I'm talking in this tone, I'm not upset with Ben Greenfield because he's just asking questions. He represents, I believe, the lay person, and that's fine. But I'm talking this way because first of all, I'm recording a video, but also I believe that Jay Feldman is going to 100% agree with what Ben is saying and corroborate his statements here. Okay, when you do anything that's inflammatory, you increase ROS production as a consequence of that. Okay, so basically anything inflammatory is hormetic. No, because that's the logical extension of that.
Energy depletion, cold therapy, heat stress.
Okay, cold therapy is actually not exactly something that you should be doing at all times. Okay, it can be hormetic depending on what your goals are, sure. However, when you expose yourself to cold, what you do is you cause vasoconstriction, and if you have worked out and applied a stimulus to your muscles to grow, so you've damaged your muscles, well, there's going to be vasodilation in your muscles that is required for them to grow, and if you get into a cold bath directly after an exercise, you constrict those blood vessels, and if anything, you actually reduce the healing of those muscles and therefore subsequently reduce the amount of size you can gain from the same exercise that someone else that doesn't go into cold therapy, that is your theoretical genotypically and phenotypically identical twin, would have if they once again didn't go into cold exposure. So it can be hormetic, or it could just be a negative. In fact, Dr. John Jaquish has actually talked about this, and it was a theory I held before he even talked about it. Okay, so careful with cold exposure. You just have to time it right. It can interfere with muscular growth. It can interfere with hypertrophy.
Exercise stress, etc. Tell me about how hormesis kind of fits into the whole bioenergetics model that you just described.
Well, exercise can enhance the amount of tissue you have for oxidative processes. It can increase heat production as a result of that. It does increase basal metabolic rate, absolutely. I guess now that I'm talking about it out loud, oftentimes when I'm talking aloud, I'm actually thinking aloud. It doesn't really fit into the bioenergetics model because his bioenergetics model is about maximizing ATP production. And I mean, I guess muscle does because it increases the absolute amount of ATP you're producing because you have more tissue on your body for oxidized substrates. But is that necessarily a good thing? Is that what makes increased muscle mass a good thing? No. So anyway, let's see what he has to say. Let's stop speaking for Jay Feldman here. Coach Feldman.
So as you said, hormesis is built on the idea that, at least originally, it was something that was very toxic. Mercury, cadmium.
Okay, no. This is not hormesis. Sorry. You reap benefits after a hormetic stress is imposed onto the body, okay? According to this logic here, smoking is a hormetic stress. Smoking is hormetic, guys. Just smoke a little bit and then you'll actually be benefiting your health in the long term. What the hell are you talking about?
Ionizing radiation would cause damage, and our bodies would respond to that damage and, basically become stronger as long as it wasn't too much, as long as the dose was small enough. And then as a result, we would see an improvement in health. That's really—
Okay, so that's ridiculous. And I just covered why that's ridiculous. That's stupid because that is not necessarily the case at all.
The idea started, and since then it's expanded to encapsulate a lot of different things that we do in our day-to-day lives that might cause stress.
Okay, so you're saying it's expanded, actually, so it hasn't been corrected. Okay, so now it has been corrected by me, okay, because that's ridiculous.
Whether it's exercise or a low-carb diet or fasting or cold—
A low-carb diet is not a stress, so that was your implication there, and we covered that in the beginning, didn't we?
Sure. And we see similar pathways, just like with mercury. You see inhibition of mitochondrial respiration, you see an increase in oxidative.
Okay, so that's just something that you shouldn't be consuming then, and you shouldn't be exposing yourself to, Jay. Your body can get better at withstanding that stress if it's exposed to it long enough and frequently enough. Sure, it does that with everything. It also does that with smoking, Jay. We phenotypically adapt. It's called epigenetics, okay? Does that mean that you should be doing that thing? What is the benefit you are reaping after the stressor, Jay? If the benefit is better handling the stress, that's not a benefit, is it? The more I smoke, that benefits my health. Well, how? Because my body gets more adapted and acclimated to smoking. How the f does that make any sense?
And you see the activation of defensive pathways, in our body.
Great. You also see that with sulforaphane. NRF2?
Experience these things, they try to upregulate their antioxidant systems to prevent oxidative stress. And they release a number of different hormones to deal with the stress that we're dealing with. And so the idea is that—
Great. Yeah, so this is just stupid, isn't it?
Those things are beneficial because they cause a small amount of stress that our bodies are able to adapt to.
If they're only adapting to the stress and there are no other effects that are associated with it that are in any way conducive to hedging against injury, your overall flourishing as an organism in this world, then it's not hormetic, is it, Jay? My body will adapt to the damage that smoking induces. That does not make smoking hormetic. That is not how that works. Because what are the other enhancements I get? Better breathing? No. Better lungs? No. It's just nonsense. And that is a key fallacy to note here. Because if he starts to say that a low-carb, ketogenic diet, carnivore diet, is a hormetic stress, but it is overall a stress, well, that's his issue right there.
Become healthier in the process.
Right. Sounds fantastic.
It does. It does. The issue comes about when we start to get into the specifics. So as I was saying, there's actually no difference in terms of the stress and oxidative stress pathways between something like mercury, like a heavy metal that we know will kill you in a relatively small dose. Same thing with cigarette smoke. Same thing with very toxic byproducts from bacteria like lipopolysaccharide. Those share the same stress pathways with exercise or with fasting or with a low-carb diet. And
Great. So what? And I'm sorry, a low-carb diet? Stress pathways? So I'd love to see what pathways you're talking about, first of all. Let's see if they're even stress pathways in the first place. And also, I'd love to see if they actually are indicative of distress, let's say. If a low-carb diet, a ketogenic, carnivorous diet, whatever, all of those diets actually causally contribute towards the activation of those pathways. Invariably, necessarily, at all times. Because I really don't think so.
Thermogenesis as well. And so what we might say is that, well, I guess as a starting place, that might want to lead us to have some caution about doing these things, right? If they're activating the exact same pathways.
Well, when you say that they're
Okay, Jay, that's nonsensical. If I cut myself right now, that induces inflammation. That'll induce inflammatory pathways. If I just stab myself in the stomach, okay? If I exercise, those same pathways will be upregulated and activated because all inflammation will activate the same pathways. Does that mean that they are equivalent? Those two things? No. They're not only not equivalent because of the fact that one is more severe than the other and therefore the inflammatory pathways are more upregulated in the stab wound situation as opposed to the exercise situation. That's not the main reason why they're different. The main reason why they're different, just because inflammatory pathways are upregulated does not mean the activities themselves are the same and have the same after effects. If I stab myself in the stomach, I will most likely die. If I exercise today, which I did earlier, I will not die. Okay? I didn't. Good stuff.
in the same pathways. For people who might not fully understand what that means, what those pathways are, what do you mean when you say like a cigarette would activate the same pathways as, say, like fasting.
I mean, frankly, who cares what the pathways are? Seriously, who cares? The only reason why I care even a little bit is because I want to see what the pathways are so I can see if they actually are stressful pathways so that I can eviscerate his claim even further that a low-carb ketogenic carnivore diet is contraindicated.
So you basically
Buy now, link in the description below.
see the upregulation of various kind of defensive pathways. You see increased activity of AMP kinase. AMP kinase is produced when there
AMP kinase, yes. AMP kinase is activated when there is a buildup of AMP, okay, adenosine monophosphate. Adenosine monophosphate can't build up too much in a cell, or else it will disrupt the purine pool and the equilibrium of ATP synthesis. So it does have an action on AMP kinase temporarily, and then most of it is actually converted into IMP, and then it goes through a different pathway. And that involves the production of ammonia, which then immediately turns into ammonium, and blah, 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 urea cycle, stuff like that. AMP kinase actually shuts down inflammation, though, Jay. You do realize that metformin's only effect is inhibiting complex 1 of the electron transport chain, thus leading to an increase in AMP, causing AMP kinase to be activated. That's literally what it does. It shuts down your inflammatory pathways, Jay. In fact, that's one of the things that makes metformin dangerous. One of the many things. Imagine you actually need to undergo inflammation because there's an injury going on and you're taking a drug that actively inhibits your inflammatory pathways.
a lack of ATP. Basically, as ATP gets depleted, there's an increase in AMP, and that increases AMP kinase. We see increases in a pathway.
Yeah, but how is that stressful, Jay? I mean, AMP buildup is indicative of low energy production, so that is bad from a bioenergetic perspective, but it actually shuts down inflammation. So if anything, you'd have a decrease in ROS production, wouldn't you, Jay? So anyway, it's also important to note that usually before you have a buildup of AMP, you have a buildup of ADP and PI, which actually causes inflammation. If you have slight reductions in redox potential, that'll cause inflammation. If you have extreme deficits leading to a buildup of AMP, which actually happens during exercise, which is what he's kind of referring to here. He says all of them are connected. Exercise is connected with this and this and this because they're all activated in the same pathways, AMP kinase. Yes, exercise activates AMP kinase. But yeah, if you get a buildup of AMP, then you actually shut down inflammation because your body enters a crisis mode and it needs to basically extract any energy that it can from any substrates. And AMP shuts down any energy demanding processes. It's one of the other reasons why you can lose weight in the form of water and fat when taking metformin. It's not just due to a low blood glucose or a lowering of one's blood glucose. It's more sophisticated than that. It's more multifaceted.
We see increases in a pathway called the NRF2 pathway, which is
There you go. It's an antioxidant production pathway. That's literally what it is. We have been told that sulforaphane from broccoli activates NRF2 and therefore makes it good. If you consume sulforaphane, an antioxidant, supposedly, and it causes your body to create more antioxidants in response to it through the NRF2 pathway, does that not indicate to you that sulforaphane is inducing injury to your tissues and causing oxidative stress, especially considering the fact that sulforaphane is considered anti-cancer because of its ability to be lethal to cancer cells as well as healthy cells through the same mechanism, which is why it's used in cancer therapy? You see an increase in NRF2 when consuming sulforaphane because it's f***ing damaging you. That's the whole damn point.
pathway as well. There's a whole kind of plethora of different pathways here that are all activated in the same, from these different stressors. And they all converge in that they're causing oxidative stress, they're causing some amount of damage, and then our bodies are responding to those. And so
yeah, but just because something induces oxidative damage does not mean they are the same thing and have the same effects on the body, Jay. And even though you're not explicitly saying that, you are necessarily implicitly stating that when talking about hormesis, and we covered it.
Well, AMP kinase is something that will then, as a result of there not being enough energy, will then upregulate our energy production, or
yes,
upregulate antioxidant systems. Another pathway that gets activated is called the NAMPT pathway. And this gets activated
not familiar
when we have a lack of NAD plus, which is one of the main.
Okay, and how does that happen, Jay? It happens when you induce inflammation because of a decrease in the redox potential of the cell. That's actually the consequence of it. You lower the NAD to NADH ratio. That is a measurement of oxidative potential of a cell, the redox state of a cell. So yes, of course, during inflammatory situations, you will have a decrease in that ratio and an increase in whatever enzyme or molecule is activated in response to low energy status.
Molecules inside of our cells that helps us produce energy. And when that's low, we increase the activity of NAMPT, which is an enzyme that increases the production of NAD. So it's these universal pathways that happen anytime we're stressed, anytime we encounter something that's harmful, anytime that we are seeing basically damage to the cells. These are the kinds of pathways that we're talking about.
Okay, got it. Oh, keep going. Go ahead.
Well, and so what people, in the research, people will see that when we activate these kinds of pathways in different organisms, rodent models and things like that.
Rodents. Great. So we're not rodents. Okay. And if you want to pretend like you can make good inferences when it comes to mice studies about human beings, they have similar blood chemistry. That's really about it. Anyway.
We see longevity. And so we assume that these pathways must be beneficial. They must be having...
Yeah, well, first of all, who is we? And also assume, great use of the word assume there because it's actually true. You're assuming things from mice studies. We are not mice, Jay. We're not mice. Okay, and also begging the question fallacy again. Is living longer indicative of overall health status? I'm not saying that it's not, but it's a spectrum. I mean, something that can get you to live 200 years old, is that indicative of overall health status if you're laying in a hospital bed for 50 years of that? Anyway, I'll be a little easy on them there. Fine. But just because they live longer does not mean that will happen in human beings. Whatever. It's an inference. Fine.
Long-term benefit in terms of longevity and health. But what happened?
Right, but also you have to understand that they activated those pathways, and that's what seemed to result in longevity. Fine, okay? However, the things that you have to induce into the human body and impose onto the body in order to upregulate those pathways are not only upregulating those pathways. They're doing multiple other things too that were not controlled for or accounted for in the mouse study. All you did was artificially activate those pathways in mice without actually having an alteration in their behavior to cause those upregulations in those pathways. In order for us to naturally upregulate those pathways, we have to either exercise or smoke, okay? The mice didn't smoke or exercise. You artificially induced that into them. So it's not a congruous inference with what is plausible in the real world for human beings.
Is that we've missed a huge part of the hormesis picture, which is everything that's happening outside of these pathways.
You're missing the essence of hormesis in the first place, Jay.
So this is something that was delineated by Hans Selye quite a while back. And what he basically identified was that it's true that all of these different harmful aspects of our environment do share similar pathways. And this is called their stressor effects, basically the way that they deplete energy and cause oxidative stress and damage, inflammation. But they also have other effects that he called specific effects. And this is what differentiates.
Well, that's another thing too. Great. And it's also what I just said, so it's not even really another thing. Maybe it causes them to live longer. Great. What else is it doing? Is it indicated? Okay, there are 100-year-olds that look miserable, that can't even walk. So would you rather get to that point or die with effectively the same functionality you had at 21 years old, but at, 85?
Something like exercise from something like arsenic, right? Arsenic doesn't really have any beneficial specific effects.
There you go.
The main things that it does are basically impair mitochondrial function, block our ability to produce energy.
Yes, specifically arsenate, which inhibits your glycolytic pathway through a specific type of inhibition. Glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase inhibition, I believe, actually. Can't remember what type of inhibition, whether it be competitive, non-competitive, uncompetitive, doesn't really matter.
Some major damage, whereas exercise, while it does cause similar effects to a small extent, it also has a number of other benefits. We're increasing lymphatic flow and circulation, and we have stimulation on the muscle fibers that will stimulate hypertrophy, and there's neurological interactions there that will improve strength as well. So there's a number of other things that happen that we call the specific effects. And what Hans Selye identified was that if the specific effects outweigh the stressor effects, we have a net benefit. So in the case of exercise,
right, and also you have to be careful then with labeling something as a benefit when there's no evidence that it is a benefit, just because it is assumed or presumed to be such a thing. You have to be careful. This would all be very simplified and much more simple if we just lived an indicated lifestyle. Indicated being living a lifestyle that imposes forces and really stimuli on our genes that our genes have evolved within in terms of that environment for the longest period of time. Okay? So eat a species-appropriate, species-specific diet. That being a 100% carnivore diet consisting of the flesh and associated fat of large ruminant animals primarily, okay, and drink water and add salt to taste, okay? You can have some slight variation here and there. For example, we're not exactly the most evolved to eat eggs because we didn't eat eggs regularly throughout our existence as much as we ate red meat, for example. However, the reason why we say that it is still appropriate, at least to an extent, is because the profile of that food, the fatty acid profile, the amino acid profile, the nutrient profile, is more congruous, far more congruous with what we did evolve eating the most of, which was red ruminant meat, as opposed to plants. So even though it wasn't the specific food, it is congruous with the specific food, like 90% that we did evolve eating for the longest time. So anyway, hope that clears that up.
We can most of the time have a net benefit if we're doing a moderate amount of exercise.
Okay, great.
If we're excessively exercising, and we see this, in the most extreme examples of marathoners for, as a clear one.
Yes, but also you see it in other types of exercise as well, because not all exercise is the same. So what do you mean by exercise? It's vague. There's different types of exercise. Excessive marathon running is anything more than 0 seconds, because you should not be jogging and doing moderate intensity, steady state cardio exercise, or what's considered cardio exercise colloquially, ever. You will strip muscle mass off of your body slowly. It counteracts your resistance training if you're pairing it with that, okay? Even if you don't see a net loss of muscle, you are most likely reducing the amount that you could attain. So that's great. And also there's a large association between low bone density in marathon runners as compared to normative levels of the population. And also there is an association between that and a high adiposity to muscle cell ratio. So they're effectively skinny fat. Association doesn't equal causation. Fine. It could be the diet that most marathon runners eat. I would almost guarantee that it's actually that, but still doesn't change the fact that we did not evolve to be doing that anyway in the first place. So again, that's how we can simplify this. Did we evolve doing this for long enough for our genes to have adapted and acclimated to that stimulus? No. Well, then don't do it.
And to see some negative health effects when we're doing too much exercise, we're incurring too much stress relative to the benefit of
distress. We need to be specific here.
Whatever it is that we're doing.
Right, the so-called Goldilocks effect.
Exactly.
Never heard of that, but fine.
Exactly. But it's not just a matter of the dose makes the poison, because when we start to get into that conversation, and this has happened in hormesis, people will start to say, well, the dose makes the poison for anything, right? With water, the right amount is good, too little is bad, and too much is bad as well.
Right, because the dose does make the poison, always. But the question is not what the dose is that makes the poison, it's whether it's required in the first place, and what the net benefit is of those things. And it's not only the net benefit, because if 60% of the effects are beneficial of something and 40% are not, well, then it's not about, the net. It's still going to be something that you probably shouldn't be doing. It's really about the absolute negatives. At least both are needing to be considered here. So anyway.
And then they attribute that to stress. So they say, well, if it follows this dose response curve where a little bit is bad and too much is bad, but right in the Goldilocks zone is okay, it must be due to stress. And the water must be having a stressful effect. It must be hormetic, and that's where we're getting our benefits from. So it's true, there is
okay, so nonsense.
Goldilocks zone for all of these things. There is a dose response curve, but in the research that has been taken to mean it's supportive of hormesis, when I think we need to be really careful about that.
Okay, so something like exercise. I can do that. It causes stress, but there's side benefits. I get stronger. I might have improved VO2 max, bone density, less frailty, better mobility, better mental health, improved sleep, etc. In the case of a cigarette, there's oxidative stress, but the benefits might be, a little bit of weight loss from the nicotine, some alertness, but the amount of toxic side effects outweigh the pros of that type of hormetic stress.
Again, begging the question fallacy though, because weight loss is not exactly indicated. Depends on what the weight is made up of, and it depends on how you're losing the weight. I can cut my leg off right now and lose weight. And so if your marker on a study for health is how much weight someone has lost, then I have improved my health by cutting off my leg and bleeding out, okay? Once again, just like I said, we have to be careful with what we consider beneficial or not. Every single thing that I warn of before I play the video any further is borne out here.
Now, what about when you get into something like, say, fasting or carb restriction? Two things that you also mentioned as potential hormetic.
Two things that we should be doing, actually, especially the latter. Okay, food restriction is not something that you should be doing all the time, and it also depends on how long you're doing it. Depends on how fat adapted you are at the time of the embarkation. Anyway.
Yeah, and those I would say fit in the exact same way. So there are benefits, of course, to low carb and ketogenic diets and fasting. There's also
it's the indicated diet and dietary behavior for human beings. Actually, for all carnivores, Jay, and we are carnivores. We are at the top of the energy pyramid for a reason. The bottom of the energy pyramid are herbivores. The middle are omnivores. And at the very, very, very tip top are the carnivores. And at the very, very, very tip top of that, we were the apex predators, weren't we? We wouldn't be anymore if all industry progress was completely vaporized and we were left to live like the cavemen again. We would not be the apex predators anymore, probably, but that's a story for another day. But anyway, yeah, so we are the apex predators and we consume a carnivore diet, okay? And before people say, well, humans and animals are different, in one way are they different, in only one way. It's with our ability to reason. We can reason, no other animal can, okay? Everything else that you might consider to be different from human beings and animals are subsidiary to that. So with our diet, no, it's not different at all. Or I guess what I should say is that it shouldn't be, because it actually is nowadays, because we're making stupid decisions.
Inherent negatives due to the stress that they cause. And it's not a small amount of stress either. One thing that people will discuss when it comes to low carb diets is that, over time, you don't see a long-term increase in cortisol. What you
Yeah, it's actually true. Didn't I just cover this in the beginning? Okay, but he said, so what is it?
see, and we can get into this in more detail because you do still see long-term elevated stress. But
no, you don't, Jay. We covered this in the beginning. No, you do not. And by the way, once again, there is a difference between stress and distress. Your implications are distress. There is no evidence for that anywhere. Glucagon is not a distressing hormone. Jay, nothing the body produces on its own is distressing, okay? It is indicated to have been produced. It becomes distressing when an externality that is imposed onto the body comes in and raises the amount of certain compounds in the body that they may have produced endogenously, according to what the genes are encoded for, but that was still indicated to have been produced. The contraindication is the externality. Anyway, so if you want to say that the carnivore diet is the externality that is harmful because you do see an increase in glucagon or something, then we can have that conversation and then I will eviscerate that. But glucagon is not a distressing hormone. There's no such thing.
The short term, what they call short term, you see elevated cortisol. That short term is normally about 4 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks even.
Great. Okay, and we covered why that would probably be the case.
There's very few things that we can do that cause so much stress that you'll have elevated cortisol for 4 to 6 weeks.
Oh my God, Jay, what the is wrong with you? Seriously, Jay, are you out of your mind? That is a horrible, horrible analogy. And in fact, we covered why it is. Because it's not distressing necessarily, is it? I mean, the cortisol being elevated is not in and of itself distressing, no matter what. It's the context in which it is raised for that can give you that inference.
Definitely not a small level of stress that we're talking about here.
Wait, when you...
That's your opinion. And it's based on a lack of judicious inference. It's based on ignorant inference. Asininity, Jay.
Elevated cortisol for 4 to 6 weeks, that's from what?
Also, once again, yes, what do you mean elevated? Define elevated.
That's coming from a quote, normal diet or a non-ketogenic diet, and then you go into a ketogenic diet.
Okay, so we're saying the day that you start a ketogenic diet, cortisol would go up.
Right, and so what are these people's health histories as well, Jay, that could possibly contribute to elevated cortisol? Let me ask you that as well, because these studies that you're talking about are not controlled because they can't be, all right?
Stay up for 4 to 6 weeks, like the day that you start, say, restricting carbohydrates.
Right, exactly.
And is the cortisol going up because cortisol is one of the mechanisms via which your liver and your muscle might dump extra glucose into the bloodstream?
Wow. Not so much the latter. Cortisol will not start breaking down your muscles to create glucose unless you are actively starving or you are chronically and systemically inflamed for some reason. That's not going to happen.
The same thing that people notice if they're wearing a continuous blood glucose monitor and wake up in the morning, get that morning cortisol awakening response.
Which is associated with a dawn effect of blood glucose. Yeah, there you go.
The surge in blood sugar. Is it similar?
So Ben seems to get it.
Going on for a longer period of time?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, well, there you go, Jay. So it's not distressing. Your body is creating glucose endogenously, and it requires some acute increases in cortisol concentrations to increase the production of the 3 primary enzymes that are involved in the production of glucose from the liver, also the proximal convoluted tubules of the kidneys, and actually the brain, to some extent, can perform gluconeogenesis, okay? Very small amount, and actually other cells, the small intestine. So anyway, fun fact. So where's your evidence that that's distressing, besides being your inane, stupid opinion, Jay? Ignorant, nonsensical opinion.
Responding to the lack of energy because there's the lack.
No, they're not responding to a lack of energy, okay? Acutely, if you abruptly change your diet overnight, which by the way, Jay, in these studies, I guarantee they did that. Guarantee they did that. So even if the increase in cortisol that is still acute, but it's so stressful because it happens for 4 to 6 weeks and there's nothing else that you could do that we can even think of doing that's stressful, that is so stressful that it will cause cortisol to increase for 4 to 6 weeks. Yeah. So anyway, if you change these people's diets overnight, then the body can enter a crisis mode that would cause a spike in circulating cortisol to compensate, because these people are more adept in terms of what their body is more adept at doing at using glucose for ATP production as opposed to fatty acids from fat that you eat or that you get from your fat cells. Again, phenotype, epigenetics. I mean, hell, if you do a 6 to 8 week transition period, you might not see an increase in cortisol at all. You ever think about that, Jay? So it also depends on how these people were transitioned to the diet. Can you put an animal that eats kibble for 5 years of its existence on a carnivore diet overnight, if it actually is an obligate carnivore like a cat, and expect it to go well? No, at least you shouldn't. You can expect it if you want to, but you shouldn't. We actually tried that with another cat. Didn't work. Literally threw up everywhere. So, hey guys, really? Coach Feldman here.
lack of carbohydrates, and our bodies are shifting over fuel to what I would say is a suboptimal fuel in fat.
Yeah, and you would say that, but who cares what you would say, Jay? You clearly don't understand human physiology, at least enough. You don't.
And that lack of energy leads to...
There's not a lack of energy, Jay. Your body will derive ATP from somewhere. It's precisely why the body increases cortisol concentrations in these situations in order to create glucose, Jay, for muscle contractions. See, I have enough glucose going through me, even though I don't eat carbohydrates, because of gluconeogenesis. And since I don't eat carbs, the efficiency at which my body can do such a thing is higher than someone that does consume carbohydrates all the time, primarily carbohydrates. Okay, fun fact, Jay, since you purportedly understand muscle energetics because he has a degree, despite the fact that my muscles are using glucose to twitch through glycogenolysis, they're also oxidizing fat in their mitochondria within the same damn cell. So they're using fat and glucose, just so you guys know that. So when people say that, well, your muscles require glucose for contraction, that's true, because they need glycogen to twitch. Your muscle fibers will not twitch without glycogen. It's not possible. In order to get the ATP to create glycogen again for the next muscle twitch, your mitochondria create it. And then PCR, the intermediate system, transfers the energy from the mitochondria over to the sliding filaments for glycogen resynthesis, and then another twitch happens. It's amazing. It really is amazing. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, actually.
Basically all of our tissues saying, alarm bells, like they're giving off alarm bells saying
no, they're not, actually. Okay, so this is just manufactured canon to justify what you believe is happening in the body, despite the absence of evidence of this being the case. Okay, Jay? Alarm bells, yes. Give us glucose so we can be glycated to That makes sense, doesn't it? We're only going for a little bit longer, by the way, guys. I mean, I can't keep doing this forever.
Energy, and that's where cortisol comes in to liberate glucose, increase gluconeogenesis, and also help to further shift us into fat burning so that we can conserve that glucose since we're not...
Cortisol is not responsible for that at all.
That we can conserve that glucose since we're not getting very much. So that's exactly why it increases, and that happens anytime we're under stress, right? Whether it's exercise or a psychological stressor, an argument with somebody or something like that, or a ketogenic diet, or mercury.
But see, this is what I mean. Okay, so mercury and f***ing carnivore are the same damn thing. This is what I said in the beginning. This is stupid.
Exposure, whatever it is, cortisol is a pretty universal response there to a stressor.
Great. So does that mean that every single thing that raises cortisol is necessarily a stressor? And by the way, technically, it is a stressor because it imposes a stress on the body. What we really mean is distressing compound or phenomenon. So let's replace it with that. Is anything that results in an increase in circulating cortisol, whether it be acutely or chronically, but acutely, most likely, distressing? Is it distressing? Always? No.
You just said that fat is a subpar fuel, and you don't hear that.
It's just ridiculous, Ben. There's no evidence to suggest that that's true. It also completely neglects to mention that most of your cells use ketone bodies and not fat. The liver is the primary organ that oxidizes fatty acids. That's the primary organ that oxidizes fatty acids, which creates ketones through ketogenesis, which allows all of your other cells, like muscle cells, to have quick ATP production, substrate for ATP production. Ketones, fast. Okay, here's another inference, guys, just so you guys know. Even in the context of someone eating a carbohydrate-rich diet, the ratio of enzymes in your liver responsible for fatty acid oxidation and gluconeogenesis and ketogenesis and blah, 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 all the catabolic pathways, to the amount of anabolic enzymes is still high, even when you're consuming a high-carb diet. Perhaps that's an inference that tells us that, well, if your body only phenotypically adapts to a carbohydrate-rich diet so much, but so much means that your ratios of catabolic to anabolic pathways are still much higher, that it's not your species appropriate diet. That genotypically speaking, we are most equipped at oxidizing fatty acids and ketones for fuel, as opposed to carbohydrates. I mean, does that not tell you that, Jay?
Often, a lot of people will say that fat is a slow burn fuel. You have more of it in your body than carbohydrates.
Well, the amount of ATP that is yielded from a substrate is not indicative of its indication, necessarily, to be fair, to play devil's advocate, because we're not picking sides here. We arrived at this area of health and this position of health through objectivity. That's what makes us special and different and correct and ethical. And so if we're going to maintain that integrity, you can't say that. A 16 carbon chain fatty acid produces about 129 ATP. Glucose, effectively pyruvate, but if you're going to include the glycogen glycolytic pathway that's anaerobic, and then the transition stage and all that stuff produces 38 net ATP. But that doesn't mean that fat is better, right? It's not how that works. It does mean that it's a more concentrated source of energy, which means that it may be better for fasting, right? So when you're fasting, your body might prefer fat instead. However, you could make the argument that, well, of course it does, because it's the only thing that it can use efficiently when you are fasting. It raises the question as to whether we should be fasting regularly or not, and then it gets into a different conversation. See, this is what objectivity does, and that's where it leads you to. So yes, even if it's a slow burn, even if it's a higher ATP yield from fatty acids, that's not what makes it indicated. That's not what makes it indicated at all. So
a byproduct of fat metabolism might be the production of ketones, which could be used as a preferred fuel for the brain or the liver.
There is no preferred fuel source by the body of anything, because preference indicates volition. It indicates will, okay? Our cells of the body do not have a will of their own. They do not prefer anything. If there is a chemical equilibrium that shifts towards the utilization of another substrate and encourages the utilization of another substrate, the body will use it. If it shifts in the other direction, it will use that, okay? It is not about preference. Our entire body is a set of chemical equilibria. There is no preferred fuel source by the body. That is not true. There is an indicated fuel source for the body, and that is inferred from many different areas of science. Please refer to my book, link in the description below. Once again,
the heart or the diaphragm. I mean, I could go on and on, but a lot of people say that fat, particularly in people who have followed a low carb diet for long enough to have become more adapted at burning fat, is a superior, not a subpar fuel. But you call
well, it does seem to be a superior fuel, not due to its ATP production, but because of the fact that fat within a cell doesn't destroy it, as opposed to glucose above a certain concentration. Fat can safely pool in a cell and it doesn't do anything. It's actually seen as fatty droplets under a microscope in cells. Glucose does not do that. It destroys cell organelles, destroys lipid rafts, tears cell membranes to pieces, binds to nuclear DNA and causes mutations to it, actually, which may or may not contribute to carcinogenesis. Probably not. It has to do with mitochondrial DNA when it comes to cancer, but still, whatever. And if anything, the oxidation of pyruvate, the derivative of glucose, actually does, once again, if anything, seem to cause more ROS production, because it creates more NADH, which enters through complex 1, as opposed to FADH2, which fat contributes more to, that enters through complex 2. Skips complex 1 entirely. So, I mean, anyway, there's many inferences that we have. Glucose is not required for oxidation in the body. That is a fact. Pyruvate is not required for oxidation in the body. That is a fact. 100% unequivocal fact. Glucose is required for two cells. Did you know that, Jay? It's required for muscle cells to twitch, and it's required for astrocytes in the brain. It is not required for neurons in the brain. It is not required for oxidation in muscle cells, not at all. Pyruvate tends to start being oxidized in muscle cells whenever exercise gets intense enough and lasts long enough. Sure, fine, because the equilibrium shifts. But right now, as my muscles twitch, they're not oxidizing pyruvate, Jay. They're oxidizing fatty acids and ketones. Anyway, I'm just going on a tangent here. I hope you guys actually enjoy the tangents though, because, I mean, I know that a lot of people, they watch this for entertainment, but they like the education. They like the little nuggets of information. But if you don't like that, let me know.
Subpar fuel.
Yeah. And so the first thing I want to make sure that I clarify is that I'm not saying there's no place for consuming fat. I'm not saying there's no place for burning fat. As you said, it is kind of more of a low octane, slow burn fuel. And that's perfect for tissues that don't need a lot of energy. So for example, at rest, our muscles do really well burning fat. Right.
And they also do really well during, I don't know, exercise while utilizing fatty acids. And by the way, in a ketogenic state, even when you are not consuming carbohydrates, I just said that your muscle cells start to oxidize pyruvate anyway, because the equilibrium shifts over to that. You start to produce so much pyruvate that it outweighs the chemical pressure of fatty acids and ketones. And by the way, actually, your body, even when it's oxidizing pyruvate, can still utilize ketones intermittently. They don't cross-inhibit one another like fatty acids and glucose do. So anyway.
I would say there's not really a negative effect to that. That's totally fine. But we see the issues with fat burning when we look at a place that has really high energy needs. And is
no, you don't. Okay, let's get into it. I mean, for example, how do you explain Alex McDonald, who ran, I don't know, 5 marathons in 5 days, consuming no food whatsoever and only drinking water? How do you explain that? A carnivore, by the way. Your body recycles about 75% of the fat that it accesses from its fat stores. It's one of the reasons why you can go so long without eating, actually, as long as you're fat adapted, with no problems.
Sensitive to oxidative stress. And the brain is our best example of that. So,
no, I just said that neurons do not require glucose. Astrocytes require glucose through a non-oxidative process. And guess what? Any tissue that requires glucose can derive it very effectively from the body creating it on its own in the liver or the kidneys or the small intestine or the brain.
You said when we're in a low carb state, we can be producing ketones and our brain will use those. but our brain can't use fatty acids for fuel.
So what? Most fatty acids cannot pass the blood-brain barrier. Fine. Some can, but it's not really for oxidative purposes. It's for structural purposes because your brain is made up of fat, and so you need fatty acids to enter the brain somehow. So they pass the blood-brain barrier. But who cares? There are ketone bodies. Please get to that, Jay.
For maybe less than 0.5% of its total energy needs. For the most part, it really does not use any fat as a fuel, but it can use glucose or ketones.
Correct. Just like every cell with a mitochondrion, though. Mitochondria can either use pyruvate for oxidative purposes or fatty acids, but it doesn't require pyruvate or require fatty acids. It requires one or the other. So it doesn't need pyruvate at all. It can use fatty acids. The only cells that need glucose for non-oxidative processes are muscle cells and astrocytes in the brain, not even neurons. Astrocytes do not even make up the majority of your brain.
The reason for that is exactly what I'm discussing, is that it is an inherently suboptimal fuel in terms of the amount.
In terms of what?
Of reactive oxygen species that get produced per ATP. So you have more oxygen
That's ridiculous, Jay. That is nonsensical. What is your evidence for that?
stress per ATP produced.
Show me a study for that. Show me a study where that's borne out. Nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, okay?
Fat, you create more oxidative stress per the amount of ATP that you produce.
That is nonsensical. That is an opinion that he's pulled directly out of his anal orifice.
And again, this is fine if we're talking in the muscles at rest. Because
No, actually, even if that were true, it's not fine in muscles at rest, Jay. If fat truly did that, it wouldn't be fine to oxidize ever, would it? Your logic is backwards in 3 different ways.
those reactive oxygen species kind of slow the speed of the engine a little bit. They act as an inherent brake on the system to make sure we're not producing energy too quickly.
Right, we're under.
Okay, great. So where's your evidence that fatty acids being oxidized causes that? If anything, glucose does that, but there's no evidence that I've seen that shows that either. Glucose does cause it through glycation, though, because ROS production occurs after, well, injury to tissues as a result of inflammation, which glucose causes directly, chemically speaking.
That's oxidative stress, so don't produce too much energy. Kind of very similar to how like a lot of lactic acid accumulated during exercise.
You don't accumulate lactic acid, you accumulate lactate, because the pKa value of lactic acid and the pH value of the cell fluid in which it is present and the blood in which it may be present causes it to all exist as lactate, not lactic acid.
To put the brakes on muscle contraction.
That's also not what causes the brake on muscle contraction. That is false. The pain that you feel during a muscle contraction or during an exercise that causes you to stop doing the exercise is actually not an actual physical sensation. A lot of people don't know that. That is not your muscles tearing. Those aren't micro tears. It is actually a signal from the muscle being sent to the brain to stop because it is being damaged. But the burn you feel is not the damage occurring. It is an inhibitory mechanism that has evolved over millions of years in our species to stop us from overexerting ourselves and causing irreversible harm to muscles. Lactate does not cause your muscles to lock up or burn. That's not how that works. If you study acid-base balance, you understand that lactate is immediately excreted to the level of the kidneys at about 10 to 30% of its concentration, and the rest circulates until it's oxidized.
Due to the pH of the muscle tissue.
No, not the pH of the muscle tissue, okay? If anything, Tim Noakes has talked about this, it seems to be low blood glucose, acutely during the exercise. Insufficient glucose to subserve the needs for the next muscle contraction or contractions. So, nope. So let's learn some acid-base balance before we start talking about this, all right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so that's fine if we don't need a lot of energy.
So not exactly. Not exactly at all.
In the brain, that can't fly because it's very sensitive to oxidative stress and it needs to produce a lot of energy. And so
which it does sufficiently with ketone oxidation in neurons and glucose utilized non-oxidatively through glycogenolysis and astrocytes.
The reason for this boils down to some biochemistry that I'm happy to dig into as deep as you'd like, but
okay, let's go ahead and do it.
Actually, there's a ratio of FADH2 and NADH that gets produced.
Yes, and the FADH2 to NADH ratio is higher with fatty acids. So what? If you start talking about electron backflow, that will immediately demonstrate your incompetence when it comes to biochemistry. If you start talking about the Krebs cycle and how fatty acid oxidation interferes with it, like a Raypedian, like an average normal Raypedian, misinformed Raypedian, then I can't promise that I will continue watching this video.
We're burning different substrates. When we produce carbohydrates, that ratio is much lower, meaning that there's much more NADH produced and much less FADH2.
Correct, yes.
When we produce carbohydrates, you mean when we consume carbohydrates?
Yeah, when we burn.
Okay, when we burn carbs, we do what now?
There's a higher amount of NADH and a lower amount of FADH2.
Correct, yes. So what?
Produced.
If anything, that's a bad thing. If anything, Jay. But anyway.
Burn fat, the opposite is the case. There's about...
Great, and the ratio doesn't increase too much, by the way.
250% difference in terms of how
Okay, so that's a relative outcome statistic. So what are the absolute differences that we're talking about? 250% of what, Jay? In fact, let's just go ahead and do the math right now. I already did it. 116 carbon chain fatty acid results in the production of 31 NADH, 15 FADH2, and nets 129 ATP, which equates to a 0.48 FADH2 to NADH ratio. One glucose molecule produces 2 NADH in the cytosol, 6 NADH elsewhere with pyruvate, so 8 NADH and 2 FADH2 and nets 38 ATP, which equates to 0.25 ratio when considering cytosolic NADH, or 0.33 if you exclude cytosolic. So we should include the cytosolic, and that means that it's actually a 92% greater ratio in fatty acid oxidation if using the 0.25 statistic. In fact, if you use the 0.33 one, it's about 45% greater. So I don't really know where 250% came from, but either way, this is still begging the question as to whether electron backflow even occurs when it comes to, I don't know, an increased production of FADH2 in fatty acids, but also you have to understand that the NADH ratio actually decreases in fatty acid oxidation as compared to glucose oxidation, which may therefore curtail any potential electron backflow that there is because less NADH would be transferred, proportionally speaking, to complex 1. So anyway.
FADH2 gets,
and that's assuming that math is correct in the first place,
relative to NADH. So we have an opposite effect. And the result of that is that when we go down to the electron transport chain where we produce ATP,
which you probably don't understand. I'm putting it very bluntly. I'm not being nice anymore. I wasn't in the first place, actually, but
basically things get slowed down when we're burning.
No, they don't. No, they don't, Jay. Not to mention the fact that, once again, ketone bodies are the main fuel source for all cells in ketosis. Liver cells are the ones that produce ATP from fatty acids and ketones from fatty acids, actually, and primarily. Okay? Also, do we not have intracellular antioxidants that we have evolved to create in order to curtail ROS production and the effects of reactive oxidation species? It's not to say that, therefore, you can feel safe with any amount of them, no matter how high, but it just depends on the absolute difference of ROS production, even if what he is saying were to be true, which it's not, but let's say it were to be. How much of a difference are we talking about anyway?
We're burning fat, and there's a lot more reactive oxygen species that get produced. And so this is...
No, so that's false. There's no evidence to support that claim anywhere. And you know what? Jay will never, ever be able to actually have a paper that supports that because it has not been observed. It is a theory, and it's a stupid one.
The biochemical mechanism that is responsible for the difference in reactive oxygen species production per ATP in either case.
Okay, and why would that not be okay when you look at fats producing more oxidative stress? I mean, and the reason I ask is I would hypothesize that there might be some sort of a mechanism that would allow for a reduction of that oxidative stress, or that
Ben seems to be smarter than Jay.
Fat still might produce a more slow burning fuel, or that the ketones that you are getting from the fats would be enough to go around, since the brain needs kind of trace amounts of glucose relative to, say, all the skeletal muscle in the body anyway. So
yeah, and that's also true. So wow, I'm actually thoroughly impressed with Ben, besides the lactic acid comment.
Why it would actually be bad that fat would cause this issue.
So in the brain, it's not so much of an issue. The brain will mostly be using ketones. It'll still be using,
yeah, because this is, Ben just said exactly what I just said. We're talking about the liver primarily.
40% glucose. But for the rest of the body, most of it will be using fat. We don't produce that many ketones. Just in general, when we're on a ketogenic diet, we really only produce enough, mostly for the brain. The rest of the body is almost running entirely on fat.
Let's just say that's true for the sake of this. Let's go ahead and do that. So what, Jay? We obviously know that muscle cells can use beta oxidation. So what?
So when we're then faced with any increased energy demands, we're more prone to having lack of ATP, which, as you said...
No, you're not, Jay. Again, you just pulled that out of your ass.
If there's a lack of ATP and an increase in oxidative stress, won't the body respond in some way? And it does. And this is where those hormetic mechanisms come in.
No, Jay, because by the way, I mean, if you're going to say it's hormetic, then isn't this a good thing?
Backup pathways, We produce stress hormones like glucagon, adrenaline.
Covered that. Adrenaline is a distressing hormone, almost always. I mean, it's not in and of itself distressing, of course, once again, same logic, but it is invariably associated with distress and almost exclusively distress. Same thing with epinephrine and norepinephrine, adrenaline and noradrenaline, same things. Great. So you're going to release those during exercise, fine. So what?
Cortisol, and those stimulate the tissues to make more energy despite the oxidative stress. They basically say, this is necessary, this is top priority, make the energy anyway. And in the short term, that's not a big deal. But what we want, what we're concerned with is the long-term effects there.
And there's no studies to inform upon long-term health effects of any stimulus over any given period of time. So you're really left to hypothesize, Jay.
What we see is in a long-term low-carb diet, we still have
define long-term
levels of these stress hormones.
And they're not stress hormones. And also, what are we talking about when we say elevated? And second of all, this is a different population of people. And third of all, you've transitioned them overnight and not through a 6 to 8 week transition period. And also, what were these people doing? When did you test them? And I keep saying you. Jay, you didn't do this. I'd like to see the study.
In the form of glucagon. And then with cortisol, the levels aren't elevated at baseline, but in terms of a response to stress or response to exercise, let's say, there's a greater increase in cortisol.
So what, Jay? That is a begging the question fallacy. According to your logic, the more cortisol, the worse, which means less cortisol, the better. And so you should get your cortisol to absolute zero at all times. That is the logical extension of your philosophy here. Doesn't make any sense, does it, Jay? Who gives a flying
carb diet versus a moderate or high carb diet? And so as a result of that, again, in the moment, no big deal. We produce energy either way and we're fine. There's a little bit of damage as a byproduct. But long term, these hormones act as a signal for our bodies to turn down their metabolic rate.
No, they don't, Jay. You have higher metabolic rate on a ketogenic diet. It has been borne out if you do it properly and if you are eating sufficient protein. Jay, uncoupling protein, higher caloric release, uncoupled mitochondria. Jay, you have lower metabolic rate when you're not consuming sufficient protein, you're not deriving a sufficient insulin response from your pancreas. Then your body starts to slow its metabolic rate because it's starving because you're not eating enough food. By the way, I keep promoting the course. I mean, this is the stuff we can help people with. If you need help with getting more protein down and the foods that you're eating don't seem to allow you to do that, your stomach is just so full, there's ways around that. There are ways around that, and there are people that you can consult with in the course, which will be linked in the description below, at least the way that you can reach out to us about joining the course. Consider that.
Recognize that this is not sustainable. We have to continue to pull these resources from our stores. That's what the stress
Okay, so we covered this already. This is the highlight from the beginning, so we'll just let this run through.
And we're producing a lot of oxidative stress in the process. So even though that engine isn't working as well, the fuel isn't optimal, we're kind of forcing it anyway. And this has effects on kind of the larger umbrella of our hormonal state, namely at our thyroid, and also in terms of the reproductive hormones. So what we see as a result here, let's just say of elevated glucagon, is you're going to see a reduction.
Define elevated.
The conversion from the inactive thyroid hormone T4 to the active thyroid hormone T3.
So fucking what? Jay, you do understand that when it comes to assessing whether someone has a thyroid issue, the ratio of the hormones, TSH and T3 primarily, matters more than the absolute value of them. Presentation matters more than blood markers. I would not trust you as a clinician. You know why? Because if someone presented to you with perfect symptoms all across the board, perfect presentation rather, all across the board, but you saw that their levels didn't match within the range that you think is appropriate for their physiology, as someone that has been on this earth for hardly a fraction of the time that our genes have evolved, then you would tell them, most likely, I would suspect, that they should change their diet still, that there's a problem with them because their blood levels are wrong. Jay, this is nonsensical. Presentation over blood work. That's how it works. All of these blood work scales, so to speak, they're based on arbitrary cutoffs and they're based on normative levels of the population, that population being heavily deranged. Why would we want to be normal, Jay?
And what that does...
You're too normal.
Slows our metabolic rate down. Since T3 and our thyroid hormones in general are the main ones that keep our metabolic rate up, we see a reduction in T3, which lowers metabolic rate.
Right. So abs.
Okay. So also begging the question fallacy that a higher metabolic rate is always necessarily good and a lower one is always necessarily bad. It depends on the context. Okay. You know, there's such a thing called hyperthyroidism, which will cause muscle wasting because your metabolism is too high, Jay. So what's your arbitrary cutoff that you would arrogantly assert as being the cutoff? What is it, Jay? You have one?
Right. So absence of adequate glucose is putting the brakes on T4 to active T3 conversion.
Adequate exogenous glucose is 0 grams, always, under every single circumstance, Ben. And Jay, mainly Jay, because Ben, you're just iterating what he has said to him in order to ensure that you are interpreting what he is saying properly, which is actually a very good trait. That's what's called actually listening. which most people don't know how to do today.
And as a downstream effect of that, we then see lowered production of the reproductive hormones as well, which depend on T3.
So once again, begging the question fallacy that a lowering of a certain amount of hormone, an absolute value of a hormone, is necessarily at all times bad. And therefore the opposite is true, therefore meaning that an increase is always good, no matter what. There's no limit, so absolute zero is indicated. Good, Jay, because that is the logical extension of what you are saying. It is a fallacy.
Directly impaired by hormones like cortisol. So we see a reduction in things like testosterone, reduction in...
So what, Jay? That is not what you should be assessing. You should be assessing, are there symptoms that people experience on a low-carb, ketogenic, carnivore diet, invariably when properly tenured and properly fortified and properly transitioned to, that are indicative of low testosterone, a lack of an ability to build sufficient muscle mass, heart palpitations, fatigue, lightheadedness, anger issues, mood disorders? Jay, are there any? You are focusing on a number.
The female reproductive hormones as well.
So what? We covered this, didn't we? The female reproductive hormones. Okay, so does a carnivore diet interfere with fertility for women and libido for women? Ask Jessalyn Randall, who's pregnant, or at least was, on a carnivore diet. Was carnivore all the way throughout it.
Something that's seen in epilepsy patients who are, have to be on a ketogenic diet long term, and the women have incredibly high rates of amenorrhea. And
what was the ketogenic diet they were on? Was it a carnivore diet? I would suspect not, because most of those studies did not employ a carnivore diet. What they did was they just reduced glucose. You know what people on a keto diet, in the overall keto space, like the super high fat, super low carb, and low protein space, have in common amongst each other? Electrolyte imbalances and disturbances, and they're usually frail. What a shock. Keto is an umbrella term. What do you mean by keto? You know there's a plant-based keto diet, Jay. Were these people consuming a carnivore diet?
Kind of reproductive issues on a ketogenic diet due to the disruption in those hormones. Great.
So a ketogenic diet, just a broad blanket term in order to disparage every single form of a ketogenic diet, one of which is actually the species appropriate, species specific, indicated appropriate diet for our species.
Do you think the hormonal disruption is due to so much cortisol being produced that there's fewer building blocks for hormones like estrogen or testosterone, or is there a direct impact on things like follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone?
Okay, so a lot of big words here. Mainly, the theory goes that cortisol and testosterone compete for production. That's really what it is. And so the more cortisol you have, the more resources that could be used to synthesize testosterone go towards cortisol, less of it goes towards testosterone. That's the theory, at least. Some people do not see decreases in testosterone on a carnivore diet. My best friend Caleb, who's effectively on a carnivore diet, he's low carb carnivore. The only thing he has is white rice in his bowl of beef or whatever. It's just a little bit. I mean, he has 800 and 900 nanogram per deciliter testosterone, and he's had that for years. So, I mean, if you want to attribute it to white rice, you know what? Maybe, but it's pretty low carb. So anyway.
FSH and LH, meaning do they require some type of glucose similar to the T4 to T3 conversion to adequately produce something like testosterone? Or is it more just that?
No, because you don't require any exogenous glucose under any circumstances throughout your entire life. So
too much of the building blocks is going towards cortisol.
It's not even the building blocks or even a need for glucose. It's more of the hormones. So cortisol on its own will inhibit GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone, which then will reduce FSH and LH. So then you're going to get a downstream reduction.
Okay, so this is mechanistic speculation, and it's reductionism, fine. It still goes back to the exact same damn point. Is a lowering of these hormones necessarily indicative of a negative heart health outcome and presentation? And vice versa with cortisol. Is an increase in hormones like glucagon and cortisol necessarily indicative of distress occurring, a negative heart health outcome occurring, and a negative presentation? That is a rhetorical question, because the answer is no.
Upstream negative feedback.
I mean, you can speculate all you want about why it occurs. It's a begging the question fallacy. It begs the question as to whether this means anything at all.
By cortisol.
And at the actual locations as well. So at the testes, for example, if you introduce cortisol, it'll lower testosterone production. And if you take away T3, it'll impair testosterone production.
This is all also not to mention that, once again, the increase that you saw in cortisol in people that were immediately transitioned overnight, by the way, I'm going to keep emphasizing that, to a carnivore diet, was acute for 4 to 6 weeks. So, cool.
Since T3 is necessary for the activity of the star protein, which allows for the uptake of cholesterol into the mitochondria and then produces steroid hormones like testosterone or progesterone.
Right. And just so I understand, when we're talking about this.
Right. And we all know that people on a low carb carnivore diet have problems with low cholesterol, right, guys? Because that's basically what he was just saying. Well, T3 allows for cholesterol sequestration in cells for hormone production. And so if you have a lack of T3, well, then you might have a lack of production of these hormones. Well, if that's the case, then wouldn't you have a lack of cholesterol as well? Lack of cholesterol sequestration? I mean, I guess you actually could make the argument that maybe that is the case, which might explain why there's a high circulating level of cholesterol in carnivores, because it's not getting to tissues, right? To play devil's advocate. So fine. Again, this is what happens. I talk, but it's me thinking out loud. So either way, though, I mean, it goes right back to the same thing, which I've pronounced a multitude of times here.
How low carb a scenario are we talking? Like, because there's different definitions.
Well, that depends on who you are, what your activity level is. Depends on your phenotype, your genotype. There's no way of actually determining that at all. Even with an interval range, you'll get a large variation there. Depends on who you are. In fact, I've actually made the argument that depending on what your genotype is, you might require about 20 grams of carbohydrates in your diet. You might not fare well on a fully carnivore diet. I mean, if you want any more evidence of the fact that I'm not a tribal dogmatist and ideologue, there it is. The reason that I promote a carnivore diet is because it's what we're designed to eat. It's not because I picked an already existing dietary tribe and now defend it to the point of being willing to die on the hill. You die on the hill of truth, not any specific ideology. You arrive at ideologies. You don't pick one.
You know, for some people, low carb. I mean, some people define me as
I mean, Ben is asking all of the questions that I've already asked here. He is an actual thinker.
carb, and I have anywhere from about 250 to 350 grams of carbs per day.
Wow. Wow.
Other people would define low carb as like 40 grams or more of a strict keto approach. But how much?
I would go lower than that. Okay, if you're someone that can subsist off of zero carbs, basically, effectively exogenous carbs, I would say don't go over 20.
Talking here as far as the body's needs and how
Once in a great while, if you have 50, it's not going to really do anything that much, but it's risky, I think.
low an amount of carbohydrate intake would cause some of the issues you're talking about.
Yeah, well, and most in the health world,
And they're not issues, Ben. That's the other thing to mention. So it's impossible to determine an interval range or any specific range at all, or value rather, at all for that. Not to mention that it's completely unnecessary in the first place because all of these issues are not issues. At least they're not established to be issues at all. Okay, if anything, they've been established to not be issues, at least not necessarily be issues, because people that exhibit these levels that he deems to be problematic are not suffering poor health presentations all across the board. And people that are, we pretty much know the diagnosis there, and it's a lack of sufficient insulin.
would say that you're having a very high carbohydrate diet, you know?
That is an extremely high carbohydrate diet, Ben. That is very high. That's actually more than the dietary recommendations for carbohydrates on food labels.
Even though for me, that's less than 30% of my total calorie intake.
Right. You don't intake calories at all. Your calorie intake is zero.
Right. Yeah, normally I would say, so I recommend 40% on the low end of carbs for most.
This is a coach, guys. This is what I'm talking about. We were in a niche area, and I'm fortunate enough to be catering towards that niche and providing you a resource to be able to combat this bullshit. There you go, everyone. 40% of your caloric intake should be in the form of carbohydrates on the low end.
Well, it's when we're looking in the literature.
Do you even know how to interpret literature, Jay?
200 grams tends to be a good low end, you know.
So even if he were right that you should be consuming lots of carbohydrates, you just gave a blanket value irrespective of your phenotype or genotype. How does that make any sense? Plus or minus what, Jay?
Typically, when you're going below 200, you really start to see these effects. Above 200, it's...
Really, Jay? What the f***? If it wasn't bad enough, the conclusion he's arrived at, are you out of your f***ing mind?
a lot more muddy, but of course that's going to depend also on our individual needs. How active are we? How much muscle mass do we have? Where's our metabolic?
Okay, there you go. So it's going to depend on a multitude of factors. So stop worrying about it and just eat the species appropriate, species specific diet for human beings. Okay. And ignore people that say antagonistic pleiotropy though, because there's no evidence that it's antagonistic pleiotropy. The diet is or something or causes that. There's no evidence of it anywhere.
Are we, have we dealt with the effects of aging over a long time and we're dealing with a low thyroid activity, then those needs would be a little, then I think 200 would maybe be a good minimum at that point. But I think for, you or me, our needs are going to be considerably higher.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, considerably higher. Yeah. Your wants are going to be considerably higher. I mean, this is just the Paul Saladino Ray Pedian fan club here. That's what we're seeing right now. This is a load of bullshit. Do not listen to these idiots. And really, by idiots, I mean Jay Feldman. Ben is just telling people what he does. Fine, go right ahead. That's why I don't react to what I eat in a day. They're innocent people. They're just saying, here's what I eat in a day. Here's what I do. You can follow it. You don't have to. There you go. Enjoy. In my bite-sized video. I don't care about that. I'm not going to pick on those people. I'm going to pick on people like Jay Feldman that believe themselves to be remotely competent to speak upon this stuff as an expert in the field. Bullshit. 300 grams of carbohydrates is probably what he's gonna say, because he said it should be far more than 200 for these people. Really? Your needs, Jay, are 0 grams of exogenous carbohydrates because you're a human being.
How much of this, because you mentioned research, how much of this has been looked at in research? Like, have they taken low carb versus high carb and looked at that cortisol?
Define low carb, define high carb, and also how did they transition these people? What were their phenotypes and what were their genotypes, and how long did the study go on for, and what were the metrics and the criteria for health in the study? These are the questions that we need to be asking when interpreting research.
Looked at hormones or looked
Okay, so begging the question fallacy. Again, covered it.
at what was the other one? Oxidation. Have any of those studies actually been done?
Yeah, so there's a lot less research than we'd hope, and a lot of the research is not particularly long-term. They'll do it
because you can't do long-term studies, Jay. They cost an exorbitant amount of money, and they wouldn't really get past an ethics committee when it comes to trying to control for confounding variables.
for a lot of times it'd be a week, but there's enough studies that they'll do at least 4 weeks or so, which some people would argue is still not enough. And so
No, that's not enough at all. Any of the results in the study, if you could draw causal relationships between the results and the intervention, would only be applicable to a 4-week period. You cannot inform upon what happens after the 4-week period. Done.
studies that go into this longer term are few and far between, but they are there and they are notable. So in the research, what we clearly see is low T3, and this
Define low, and also who the cares. What were these people's presentations, Jay?
even on people who are average.
Also, define ketogenic diet. Is it a carnivore diet that has sufficient protein in it? We're only looking at carbs and fat here.
4 years on a ketogenic diet. There's a great study that was looked at in support of the lipid energy model, the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, that whole area of research.
Which is just a waste of time, frankly. I'm sorry. A lot of people might think I'm just being a contrarian. I'm not. It's a waste of time, because who cares if you're a lean mass hyperresponder or not? Because at the end of the day, that all had to do with LDL and cholesterol. LDL doesn't cause heart disease anyway. So why do we care about looking at that? Cholesterol does not cause heart disease. Fact. So who cares if you're a lean mass hyperresponder? Who cares if you have high cholesterol?
They were looking at women who were on a ketogenic diet for around 4 years and found that they had particularly low T3 and also elevated reverse T3.
Define that. And also, was there sufficient protein consumption for their needs? Also, were they transitioned overnight? Also, even though you said that these studies went on longer than 4 weeks, how long did they go on for? 6 weeks? Also, what were their presentations?
By the kind of mainstream ranges, but I think most people would agree that those values were definitely not ideal. The free T3
No, most people that are actually sensible would not agree. They would say, we can't inform upon that, really, until we see their presentation, and we can make some inferences then. The Hippocratic Oath tells you that you are obligated to not intervene in the circumstances in which someone does not present with any symptoms. It's called do no harm, Jay.
5. They put them on a carbohydrate-containing diet for 3 weeks, and their T3 came up to, I want to say, 3.5, which is pretty significant increase.
Wow. And by significant, do you mean statistically significant? And even if you do, it doesn't really mean anything, does it? Not necessarily.
Ketogenic diet, and the T3 went right back down. So I believe right around
Okay, so who cares?
0.5 maybe.
So you see how just this hyperfixation on numbers, guys? Really?
6 or something. So we do have, and these aren't people who are already on a ketogenic diet for the long term. There are others looking at.
Okay, so those were people that were already on a carnivore diet. Great. So were they exhibiting symptoms? Were they presenting with symptoms?
See patients showing a general trend toward lower T3 and elevated TSH. As I was mentioning, the studies on epilepsy patients showing issues with the female reproductive hormones.
Okay, define issues. Jay, this is just a bunch of nonsense. I'm just repeating myself. I promise I'll be done in a minute.
So those are some of the clear ones. As far as the stress hormones go,
Let's cover that.
beta glucagon is seen pretty universally on
How lost do you have to be to believe that glucagon is a distressing hormone, or is at least indicative of distress occurring in the body? Are you f***ing kidding me? Jay, association doesn't equal causation. Did you know that? In fact, it effectively never equals causation. Ever. Even with an R-squared value of 1. It's not how statistics works, because there can be a variable that has an equal effect on X and Y that is spurious. You can't claim causality. You can also have a directly causal relationship between X and Y that has an R-squared value of 0.7 because there's another variable that is having an effect on Y or X that isn't equal to the other variable that is causing it to vary slightly. It's just ridiculous. Causality is an ideal, okay? Like God is an ideal.
Carb and ketogenic diets, at least at the 4-week mark, and typically beyond that as well.
But didn't you just say that there's not that much long-term data to back that up? Okay.
People who aren't familiar with it, what glucagon is doing.
So glucagon is kind of our first stress hormone. We've got...
That's f***ing bullshit. What the hell is going on now? Seriously? Glucagon is a hormone. It has a role to play. And none of those roles are inherently distressing. You need glucagon for survival. You will die without glucagon. Jay, what the hell are you talking about?
A few primary ones. I mean, there's a bunch, but the main ones I would focus on are glucagon, adrenaline, and cortisol.
Adrenaline? Seriously. Adrenaline. Yeah, because we all know that everyone is having hypertensive crises because of high adrenaline on a low carbohydrate carnivore diet.
Have increased
for longer than 4 f***ing weeks.
Sequentially. So in the most minor stress, you'll see elevated glucagon. In a little bit more
off
stress, you'll see epinephrine, which is adrenaline, and a little bit more intensity.
I said that.
Cortisol. And so in the studies looking at the stress hormones on people on a very low carb,
so covered that, not stress hormones. Done. Bye.
Ketogenic diet, elevated cortisol is seen at least through the first month. Sometimes
okay, so at least during the first month, and we already covered that, didn't we? So you're just repeating yourself.
As well. Elevated glucagon is seen past that point, and then
obviously, okay, if you know physiology, you understand why that is.
The other thing that's seen as well is that even though the cortisol levels aren't always elevated past that point, in people...
That's an interesting point to add there for the 10th damn time.
On a low carb diet for that long or for longer, what they see is that there can be normal cortisol levels, but inside the tissues, there's actually a reduced clearance of cortisol and an increased regeneration of cortisol.
Yeah, and that's exactly what should be happening because it's involved in glucose production.
These are based on effects at enzymes like 11-beta HSD and 5-alpha.
So reductionism, who cares? Genuinely, who cares? I love getting into the mechanistic speculation on things. It's fun. In terms of its general pragmatic application, it doesn't matter, which is why we're not going to get into it in this video, Jay, because it doesn't matter.
5-beta reductase. And so effects on these enzymes actually...
Great. So enzymes that I don't even know because I don't focus on every individual enzyme in the body. Okay. There's no need to get that specific, Jay.
Can cause high cortisol in the tissues, even if your blood cortisol looks normal, which a lot of people will say, you know, initially I saw high cortisol and low carb, and then over time it went back to normal, but you still could have high tissue cortisol.
Who cares?
Blood cortisol measurement in blood does not necessarily reflect tissue cortisol.
Exactly. It's one of the reasons why blood tests also mean nothing. The very things that you have emphasized throughout this entire damn video thus far, okay? It's why it has no weight when a vegan says that their testosterone is normal. Well, then why are you frail?
Right. You can look at the urinary metabolites of how much cortisol is getting cleared as like an indirect.
Like a Dutch test. Yeah, that's a really good point. I do recommend the Dutch test.
This is bread and circuses. It means nothing, guys. I swear I am almost done.
Because
just waiting for my screen recording to stop.
A lot of times blood cortisol values can be normal, but that doesn't mean the metabolites aren't either building up or being cleared very quickly, which was what a urine test can tell you.
Yeah, and salivary as well. I've seen people with normal blood cortisol, but very elevated salivary cortisol, especially...
Guys, I mean, is this insightful at all? Really?
Blood is normally done once a day, and our cortisol is a natural rhythm, and that rhythm can be interfered with. And so you might have normal cortisol in the morning, but it's really elevated later in the day, and you don't see that if you only get a blood test in the morning.
Okay, got it. Now, what would you say to people who would say that constant access to carbohydrates and a relative stabilization of cortisol is almost a little bit of an ancestral mismatch? Because human beings for thousands of years have had periods of time where they might have experienced famine, fasting.
Kind of like Ben, because at least even if his conclusions are not something I agree with, he asks the right questions, which means he's a good listener and he's a good thinker.
needed to push through without a lot of fuel on board while, say, hunting or gathering, and that by simply saying, well, let's just give ourselves ad libitum carb access throughout the day so that our cortisol stays low and we're just kind of, fat and happy, so to speak, really is not the way that human beings have operated from an ancestral standpoint. And this would be a relatively new phenomenon to propose just eating carbs 365 days a year, 24/7, without having periods of, say, carb depletion or fasting.
So screen recording cut out at the very end there. I'm sure that you guys just saw that. But anyway, I let him finish his sentence. You could probably hear it picking up on my microphone. I'm not actually going to cover that because the video, we're done. This might be my longest video I've ever recorded, which is actually pretty fitting because I'd like for that to happen as my first upload back kind of thing. A little special video for you. But anyway, all of that was a complete waste of time. I don't know how many times I have to say on this channel that blood tests do not reflect health status. They don't. For two reasons. Number one, if your presentation is great, stay the out of it. Okay, your body knows what it's doing. But second of all, Jay actually said it himself. Blood levels do not reflect tissue levels necessarily. They don't. Okay, so forget it. What people tend to do is they just miss the forest for the trees. They see a portion of the forest, right? So not the full forest. They see a portion of the forest. In order to try and understand the full forest, they look at each individual tree, and then they look at the individual tree or an individual tree, and then they look at the bark of the tree, and then they just get more microscopic. That's not what you do. Broad is better. That is a rule. The broader the inference, the better the inference, oftentimes. Most of the time, at least in my experience, okay? To simplify literally all of this, genes evolve under the environment in which you place them over long periods of time genotypically. For 4.5 million years, if you include proto-humans that preceded our current speciation, that being Homo sapiens sapien, we have consumed primarily the flesh and associated fat of large ruminant animals. We have sought salt out once in a while, but we actually did drink some blood or have some of the fluid innately in the raw meat for our sodium intake and electrolyte intake, fine. But we did still seek out salt, and we drank water with very minimal plant material, very minimal fruit, okay? And the fruit was small in the first place and fibrous and seldom encountered. Since genes evolve under the environment in which you place them, part of that environment being your diet, we can assume, and we can infer, rather, that we should be consuming what our genes are most acclimated to, or else we risk, when transgressing from that congruency, some adverse health outcomes. If you would like to take that risk, fine, but understand that it is not what is appropriate for your physiology. We also know other inferences, like there is not one required gram of carbohydrate exogenously speaking. However, you could make the argument, and I'm actually going to put this into my third edition of my book, because of course I always find new additions to add in, the existence of gluconeogenesis, which makes it to where you don't need to consume any carbohydrates to speak of for survival, does not necessarily mean that you shouldn't be consuming carbohydrates, because, for example, hummingbirds, they're nectarivores, so they consume nectar, and sunbirds and other birds like that, they consume straight glucose. That is their diet, it's their species appropriate diet. They also have gluconeogenesis because all animals suffer from the threat of starvation, which would require them to have a glucose supply, and they also all sleep, so they're not eating, and so they need some carbohydrates. But you dig a little deeper and you realize that for humans, we should still be consuming very minimal, at least, carbohydrates. But anyway, that's for another day. There's other inferences that you can make. But we know that we have been consuming that diet for 4.5 million years because every single time that you do a carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis on ancient human remains that precede the agricultural revolution, repeatedly all across the world, you will see that they were eating that diet. Chemically speaking, cause and effect. We know what diet they were eating. The signature is in the collagen of the long bones. So using mass spectroscopy and measuring the isotope ratios and all that stuff. So we know this stuff. Those are broad inferences, very broad inferences. There you go. We're done. Stop getting so specific. Anyway, sorry, that was probably also my longest outro or ending summary. So anyway, with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave a like. Please subscribe to the channel. Please leave your thoughts in the comment section below. And also, once again, subscribe to the Patreon if you haven't already, and buy my book Contraindicated if you haven't already. Once again, the first edition is almost off the online shelves. So if you want your exclusive limited edition copy, you can go ahead and buy that. And finally, most importantly, link on the bottom of the screen. What is that link? Well, that is a link that will bring you to an amazing site with amazing products from an amazing brand known as Cerule. If you purchase product through that link, you will get a permanent 10% and permanent free shipping discount when signing up for monthly deliveries. That is the caveat. And if you're curious about what those products are, who should take them, why you should take them, when to take them, etc., I would refer to the link in the top right corner of the screen, the Cerule Products link, which is a complete video elucidation and explanation of what those products are, who should take them, why you should take them, when to take them once again, etc., etc. And also, if you email me behind the scenes at edgoki14@gmail.com, you can find out how to earn those products for free like I do, because who in their right mind wouldn't want that? So, with that being said, join me next time when we react to someone else that doesn't understand that blood levels really don't mean anything and that you shouldn't look at them at all, and you should look at people's presentation. And so, in other words, join me next time when we react to someone else that breaks the Hippocratic Oath constantly. So, Till then. Welcoming back video is a critique video. No. Okay. Seriously? What are you doing?